Okay, if you remember from our conversation on Tuesday, we talked about overall systems of memory, and I mentioned that we have an analogy to the computer system, which was really set up in what's called the Atkins-Shiffrin's theory in 1968, where they much likened the development of the computer system to how our memory system or our system probably works as well. And just kind of review some of these systems. We have the sensory system, sensory memory. So this is where encoding is going to happen. This is the keyboard. This is where all information is received into the system, all your sensory information. Okay. And then from our sensory memory, our short-term memory then is that attention system that we talked about, where it attends to certain stimuli from the sensory system and kind of filters out any of the either the noise or information that it feels irrelevant. So, and again, in the computer analogy, this is that RAM, it's that random access memory, which we will see just like a computer has limited RAM, us as human beings also have limited RAM. And then if we work with the information long enough in at least the short-term memory model, it then gets converted into long-term memory, which like again, the computer, it's kind of the hard drive, as you would say. And so if we were to graphically show this, this is the original model where we have sensory input. And again, if we want to put this into brain processes, okay, sensory memory, if you remember when we talked about sensations and perceptions, all of our sensory information goes into the limbic system, specifically through the serotonin system, such as the amygdala, the memory system, such as the hippocampus. But really, it is all sensory information. So we don't block sensory information at our kind of sensory cell level. We block them within the limbic system and we filter out all the noise and the nonsense. And then everything that you feel you don't want to pay attention to. And then the rest is sent up to, and we could put it in this term, into those cortical areas. So, for example, visual information is sent up to the occipital lobe. Auditory information is sent up to the temporal lobe. Spatial information is sent up to the temporal area. Sensory motor information is sent to the sensory strip. And then anything kind of rational or social is sent up to the frontal cortical area. And then we work with that information to create, if you want to put this at this level, our perception. But it does get a little bit more complicated because in order to get our perceptions, we have to get all this new sensory information that we decided to attend to, and then we have to retrieve information from our long-term memory to make sense of it. So, for example, um, for example, when you're looking at this graph, well, this is a very kind of simple example, and you look at this term short term. And in order to interpret that the term short term, you have to retrieve information about either the definition or your experience of something that is short term. Okay, kind of a translation type thing. If you want to put it this way, long-term memory is maybe our spell check or our AI chat GPT for our sensory information that we're choosing to pay attention to. Now, the limitations of this model is that it assumed that rehearsal over and over and over is what makes it so that information goes from short-term memory to long-term memory. So if you were raised, for example, especially in the 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s, and even into the 90s, you probably had a list of spelling words, right? And in the spelling words, you sat and you wrote that word 25, 50 times. I remember the spelling worksheets I took home. There was the word at the top of the thing, and then there was the numbers, and you had to write that word 25 times. Um, Same with math. You did wrote 1 plus 1 equals 2. 1 plus 1 equals 2. And that's because based on the Akron-Schifrin model, that was really repetition and rehearsal was really the only way, according to this model, to go from short-term memory to long-term memory. So we're going to see, though, that this is a limitation of this model. Now, um, I do kind of want to talk about sensory memory before we get into the other two systems, just in a little bit. Is a thing that we should note about sensory memory is it's actually very rich and detailed information that really, when we use devices to really detect the sensory memories that people have, we find that they're at a kind of a rich and detailed intensity. And then what happens within the limbic system is they're dampered down to what the limbic system feels that the organism can work with. Okay. And it occurs on a very brief duration. And the two main types of memory, sensory memory systems that have been tested are what's called echoic memory and iconic memory, or auditory versus and visual. And really, how these are done is just through recording the sense when the sensory, for example, the light hits uh, receptor on the back of the eye, and how long that it takes to get to the limbic system and how holds there at the same intensity from when it left the sensory nerve. And based upon that evidence, we receive every bit of sensory information from our sensory cells, which is kind of an interesting thing, thinking about the amount of sensory information that that system is trying to um, deal with. Um, but we will come back to sensory memory later on when we deal with things like traumatic memories. That indeed there are senses that person may not be able to describe being present when some type of traumatic event occurred, but it was there because it was recorded within the sensory memory system, and the limbic system decided to hold on to that, but not necessarily transmit it to the perceptual area where we have a conscious reality of that information. So we'll come back to this notion of sensory memory and how certain parts of our brain do still capture a lot of that rich, detailed information, even though we may have no recollection of that sensory information. Okay. So again, I do want to talk about, before we get into the more complex model of our random access memory, some of the things that we did find from the Atkins system as far as short-term memory is concerned. And this is important when we consider things like studying. So here's some study skill tips from examining just our short-term or working memory just on this level. Okay, is that just like our computer's random access memory, it is limited. Okay. I remember my first computer had like 10 gigabytes of random access memory, and I can't even tell you what's on it on mine now. It's like 712 or something like that. So, um, in computers, this working memory, short-term memory seems to be increasing. But we'll see here in a minute that maybe ours is actually decreasing. So, because what they found originally, and I'm going to start right here, is that our short-term memory can work with 7 plus or minus 2 bytes of information. Okay. So what is a byte? Well, if you think about the number 7, and this is why phone numbers are set up the way they are, our phone numbers are based on 7 digits. So anyone in um, Arizona knows this. This is Zane's law office number, 5207777. And sorry. Anyways, and this is what a phone number is based upon is 7 digits because we found that the average person can remember 7 bytes of information at a time. And then we can divide it down because the lowest number, if it's 7 minus 2 is 5, so we could put 4 and then 3, which is usually the lowest number. So we can chunk this. So not only were phone numbers originally set up to meet that 7 bytes, but it also is meant to chunk information. So here we have what are known as 2 chunks of information. Okay. Oh, is it 55555? Oh, it's not 777. Okay. I can never remember. Okay. So this is kind of how our capacity works. So how can you use this as a study? Actually, before I go on, I mentioned that while computers are increasing their random access working memory, human beings, evidence-wise, seems to be decreasing. This was the original capacity, but research done I believe in 2012, and it was replicated 2013, 14. I'm not sure if much has been done since then, suggests that today we're probably at about 5 plus or minus 3. Okay. So the average person, according to more recent research, remembers anything from about 2 to 8 bits of information. So it seems like we're going kind of on the downslide as far as our short-term or working memory capacities. But with that said, okay, you can go online and take a lot of free, and I would encourage you to do this, a lot of free short-term capacity little tests, which will tell you what is your bits of information that you could keep in your working memory at one time. So, and I'd encourage you to do that. But um, last time I did one of these little tests, I found out that my number, the amount of information that I can hold in my short-term memory at one time is 4. Okay. So what does this mean if I want to study? Let's say I'm taking a textbook in the chapter. Okay. So I want to chunk my information like we did with a phone number. We chunked it into 3 and 4s. What I would probably do if I needed to study is I would chunk it into 4 paragraphs at a time. Okay. So I would read 4 paragraphs and then I would work with that information and work with those 4 paragraphs until I feel comfortable that I understand them. And then I would go on and read the next 4 paragraphs and then stop, process it, understand it. And once I feel like I understood those 4 paragraphs, I would go on to the next. Um, but based on this, I probably would not read an entire chapter and then try and figure out the entire chapter because that's exceeding my short-term memory capacity. That's too much information for me to be able to actually work with all of that information and obtain it. Okay. And so if you've ever wondered when you read something that you're supposed to remember, and at the end of it, you're like, gosh, what did I even read at the beginning of this? It's probably because you're exceeding your short-term memory capacity and you're getting too much information into your system to work with in order to keep those things in memory. Okay. Um, the other thing that they found with using the short-term memory paradigm is that our capacity to keep information in mind is about 30 seconds. Okay. So, and what I mean by that is let's say I had you memorize four random numbers, like let's say 3, 7, 9, 6. Okay. And then I had you read a poem for that requires about 30 seconds worth of reading or some unrelated tasks. Okay. While at about 30 seconds, if I asked what were the numbers I asked you to remember, you probably couldn't remember them. However, if I stopped at 10, 15, 20, 25 seconds, and I said, stop reading your poem, what was the number I asked you to remember? You could probably say it pretty easily because it still is within your short-term memory system, and we haven't quite pushed it out yet because we haven't exceeded your capacity. Okay. So here's another good study tip. All right. If you think you have mastered some information, what I would encourage you to do is
Is it just me or did you just like freeze?
I think
I
he's
can,
frozen.
I can no longer hear him as well.
Yeah, he froze.
Yeah, I think so too. Can you guys hear me?
I
Yes,
can
I
hear you
can.
fine.
Yeah.
Okay, I think you froze or something.
I think like something happened with his internet. Oh, he's back. Cool.
hey everyone, I think I just lost internet for just a minute.
Welcome.
Hey, you froze for a sec.
Yeah, I apologize about that. Does anybody remember where we lost contact with each other?
You were talking about the short-term memory. We were talking about how you only keep information for like 30 seconds in your short-term memory.
Okay. Right, cool. So I'll pick up from that point just to make sure. From there, thank you for telling me that. So yeah, I think as stated, what we were talking about is that the duration is about 30 seconds. And this is a good place to state well, how do I know if information got from short-term to long-term memory? Well, another good study skill that you could use is when you think you have the answer to a question and you've mastered that content, okay? And you're like, yes, I've got this down. What I would encourage you to do is walk away from your desk and everything for more than 30 seconds, like 45, 50 seconds. Go get a cup of coffee, think about something else. Go have a conversation with either your housemates or your family or whoever you're living with. Text someone, check out social media for about 45 seconds, and then come back to that question And if you can answer that question correctly, and if you could figure out the solution to the problem, that's a pretty good indication that that information has gone from your short-term memory to long-term memory. And then it should be able to be recalled in the future, okay? Albeit if your recall system is working correctly at the time you're doing your test. But that's a story for later on in this class. Okay, so these are two kind of good study skills. So chunk information together when you study it. Know that you have about 30 seconds to really, if you stop thinking about something, it'll be gone in about 30 seconds. And if you want to know if information has been transmitted from short-term to long-term memory, take about a 45-second break or longer and come back and see if you can answer that question or that concept correctly. So those are some study skills to kind of consider. Okay. Now, and this kind of, so grouping items into units, conscious repetition of information. And so these are some of the kind of suggestions of improving your short-term memory. Okay. All right. Now, the problem with the Atkins-Shiffrin's model is that it kind of was an oversimplification because we use our short-term memory to manipulate information. We use it to create our reality, what we're consciously experiencing. And so it's been considered kind of a simplification of our working or our kind of RAM system that we have. Okay. So updates to this has been known as what's called working memory. Whilst the information from the Akron-Shiffrin research still exists, we still need to chunk information together. We know the duration that short-term memory lasts. We have to add information to it, and I think we can graphically show this. Okay, this is the graph that uh, illustrates this. Now, I do want to mention, so we have input via sensory memory, and you'll notice that there's only two in the working memory system. And I just want to clarify, we have not only a auditory system and a visual working memory system, we have a pain receptor system, we have a motor receptor system, we have, but these two are the ones that have been most researched. And so this is why, so this is still kind of an oversimplification because there's more and more research considering things like pain and pressure and smell, and those systems that play a huge role in our experience and information we're working with. So, but we'll use these two because they've been the most researched. Okay. So in this model, it suggests that we have a central executive. The central executive is what decides what sensory information we're going to pay attention to. Okay. And then we have two in this model, we have two systems that we work with. We have called the visual spatial working memory and what's called the phonological loop. Okay. The visual spatial working memory is a system that sees both space, time, and visual information. Okay. And this is where we manipulate information that we're receiving visually. So, for example, on my desk, I have a Tana Otham grammar book. Okay. I recognize that book via my visual spatial working memory. And then my central executive asks, what is that? What is that I'm visually seeing? And I see the title of the book, Tana Otham Grammar. Okay. And so it's manipulating the information in order for me to make sense of my visual experience right now. Okay. On the other side, we also have the phonological loop. Okay. It's called a phonological loop because how many of us in the room have ever gotten a song stuck in our head? Okay. If you, it happens to me all the time because what we have found is much like getting a song stuck in your head, auditory information tends to loop in and out until we're done working with that auditory information. I don't know if that makes sense. So, for example, if I asked you a question, uh, do you think it will rain this weekend? Okay. What you will hear until you answer that question is, do you think it will rain this weekend? And then you'll break it down. But that auditory information will continue to loop in your head until you've done something with it, such as, no, I don't think it will. Well, it's cloudy out today, but so maybe, or yes, definitely, I trust the weatherman. Okay. And so, unlike the visual spatial, where we work with it and we're done with that visual information and we can move on from it, auditory information tends to stay within the system until we do something with it and we work with it and we get rid of it. Okay. So, for example, when we get a song stuck in our head, the reason why it's stuck in our head is, well, one of the reasons is because it is we were unable to do something with it because either we're having a continued emotional experience with it, or because we're so annoyed with it, we're trying to figure out why the heck it is in our head in the first place. Okay. And so, again, one of the recommendations, if you do get a song stuck in your head, is play a totally opposite song to that one, because it will break it up and say, well, the information is nonsense at this point, and it'll push it out. Just a recommendation to try. But again, when we get to how do these systems work when they become haywire? For example, people who have clinical depression, okay, being defined as depression systems exist in every situation in the person's life, and they tend to persist counter to what the person probably should be experiencing at the time. So, for example, a person who goes to their wedding, but they feel depressed. They feel the depressed mood, depressed motivation, maybe bouts of sadness, which are inconsistent, I hope, with that happy day or your graduation. There may be a better example. When you graduate, okay, that's really a defining features of clinical depression. One of the things that depression haywires or takes over is this phonological loop, okay, where negative thoughts get stuck and they get replayed over and over and over in the person's head. And in depression, one of the propensities then is to prove those negative thoughts. So the person spends a lot of time proving those thoughts so that they'll try and leave. Okay. And then, of course, one of the therapies for this that really is an effective one is what's known as cognitive behavioral therapy. And the cognitive part is trying to break these negative thoughts or this phonological loop of negative thoughts. So they teach things like challenging thoughts, looking at alternatives. Sometimes they'll even include things like meditation, those kinds of things to break those thought processes. Okay. So that's the phonological loop, how it works. And again, when you continually hearing something and something, it's because it's information that your central executive thinks you need to work with and figure out. Okay. Um, anyway, so that's kind of some of the research that was done on those. But the idea behind this is that we have a central executive that combines all of this information, combines information for long-term memory, and then works with it. Now, the difference between this and the short-term memory system is if the information is significant enough, meaning that it's important enough, it's experienced enough, then it'll go from short-term memory or working memory into long-term memory. Okay. So really the big difference between the original model, which suggests if you just experience something over and over and over, it'll go to long-term memory. The big added part of this is once you make it important enough, meaningful enough, then it'll go from central executive working memory into long-term memory. And that ties to what we talked about um, on Tuesday about elaboration and elaborating and how experience tends to be the best way to try and remember something or to get things to go from this working memory into long-term memory. Okay. So that's short-term working memory. Let's talk about for just a minute long-term memory as a kind of a concluding part to this. So far, believe it or not, um, uh, our long-term memory is relatively permanent with unlimited capacity. Okay. Now, that is to say, unless it is destroyed by some disease state, such as Alzheimer's, or another type of dementia that physically destroys area of the brains that deal with memory. Okay. But an intact human brain, we think, has an unlimited capacity. And in fact, um, and the now let me stop there. So you're probably going, well, my long-term memory isn't that good. Um, the problem with human beings, as we would say, is that we have an unlimited capacity. The problem is with retrieval. Okay. And again, I can use a computer model with this. I've seen some of my, if you're one of those individuals that just saves stuff randomly on your computer, um, and then all of a sudden have to figure out where did you save this file, and you spend all this time searching everywhere using your search tools and stuff like this, and you spend a long time trying to figure out where you put that information. That's not a problem with storage. That's a problem with retrieving that information from where you put it. Okay. But if we look at the capacity of the human brain based on neural connections and the number of neurons within our memory system, um, if we were to do this lecture, I haven't seen any updated based on all these supercomputers, AI, and all this kind of stuff. But it was expected that computers wouldn't meet the memory capacity of a human being until something like 2050, 2060. Um, Everyone's worried about the Terminator, right? About robots taking over the world because they have a human capacity. Well, I want you to think about this. Chat GPT takes up three-story buildings in order to give you that AI output. Um, uh, if we were to take all of the smartphones, your all our iPhones, our Androids, and everything else, and we wanted to equivalize to a single human brain, it would be a one-story tall building the size of Montana that we would have to put our iPhones in. in order to meet the capacity of a single human brain. So, are Terminators possible and everything else? I would say so, but they would be the size of Montana, one-story state of Montana. So we're not quite at the point of robots really taking over the world yet, as far as having human capabilities. Just some, if you want some relief on that end. Now, AI does have capacities, when we talk about that, but I want you to think about this. Our brains are squished into our little skull. They're about 8, 9 grams in weight and size. But again, AI system takes up an entire building and consumes giant amounts of water to keep it cool and to keep it running. And so we're a little ways off from being taken over, at least as a species, just to think about that from a practical perspective. But anyways, that's another story for another day. So we have found, though, that we do have two type of long memory storage systems. Okay. The first one is explicit memory. So this is things that we can declare that we remember. Okay. And so the two types that we know of is episodic versus semantic memory. Episodic memory is our memory for events and experience. Okay. Semantic memory is our memory of information. So, our memory for how to solve a math problem, memory of the difference between long-term memory and short-term memory. Okay. It's informational memory that we can recall. Okay. But we also have implicit memory, long-term memory. And these are things such as procedural memory, classical conditioning, and priming. Um, Procedural memories, I don't know if you remember, if I mentioned this in this class. I can't remember if it was this one or my class last night, that I mentioned that if you were to make every decision to get into your car, put on your seat belt, and put your key in your ignition, there'd be about 5 to 700 single decisions that you'd have to make. The reason why we don't have to go through that process is because of procedural memory. We just do it, but we don't have to declare each step that we're making. We just have to say, I'm getting in my car, and we do it. That's procedural memory. Okay. Right. Good examples of procedural memories is things like language, how to produce a word, um, walking, talking, breathing, all of those things that you don't have to necessarily declare or have a conscious reality of. Okay. And then classical conditioning, so that associative learning. When you hear a loud bang, you don't sit and go, "Wow, that means." No, you usually instantly respond to it. And then priming, different priming memories, kind of setting you up for what you should be expecting to experience, tends to happen on the non-declarative end. Okay. So, again, if we were to break it down graphically, we'd have the whole system here. We'd have our declarative, non-declarative, and these are things that largely happen on the unconscious level. They don't need our really conscious thoughts to do. And then this is really what's happening on our conscious level, our experiences, what we can remember as far as what our textbooks say, and those types of things. Okay. So, okay, we went through that. Okay. We went through that. Okay. So let's just finish. I think this is it on this end. No, no, no. Okay. just to kind of compare these two systems, and it's really kind of important to keep in mind. So, with episodic memories, it's about events and episodes. Semantic memory, it's facts, ideas, concepts. It's organized in time versus concepts. For emotions, our episodic memories are more important than semantic memories. Retrieval is deliberate versus automatic. Retrieval, I remember this versus I know this. And this is where it becomes kind of important because these are things that have been kind of changing. Okay. For example, education. Episodic memory is seen as irrelevant versus relevant, even though this is the stronger memory system to use. And also the things that have been challenged to these models is your experience relevant to intelligence, which we'll talk a little bit about later, versus relevant for semantic. But this is the interesting one and something that I'd challenge you to consider is episodic memories. Your memories of experiences are admissible in court. Semantic memory, facts are inadmissible in court. Okay. So this comes down to, for example, things like, well, what about genetic testing? When someone goes and compares genetics and the system comes out and says there's a 99% match. Is that admissible in court? The answer is no. Okay. So if a fact such as there's 100% genetic match between these individuals, according to the scientific findings, is that admissible in court? No, that's not. When we talk about genetic evidence was what convicted a person, is when an expert comes up and provides their experience running that test, and they can't say something that there's 100% proof that this person's genes match. The only thing they can say is when they viewed the slides of the person's genes with the genes that were on the murder weapon, they looked closely related. And in my expert opinion, the genes on the knife and the genes from the defendant match. Okay, so it has to be explained as an experience, not as a fact. Okay, so something to think about when we look at court systems, because again, our episodic memories can be false, as we saw when we talked on Tuesday. And this is why two people reading genetic evidence could come up with two different conclusions, and those can be presented in court as experiential fact for the court to consider. Okay. This is why, for example, two different clinical psychologists or forensic psychologists one can say that the person is not a psychopath, and the other one is, and the other one can say the person is a psychopath, because they're not giving the results of a test or an MMPI or something like this. They're giving their experience with the individual and their experience interpreting the test that was administered to the criminal, or the defendant, I should say. And so this is why two experts can experience two different things based on what's expected for them to experience. Okay. Something to kind of an interesting side note on how our court system works. All right, I'm going to go through here. We've talked about that. Okay. Okay. We've talked about a lot of this already so I'm just going through and long decay. Okay. I think we're good for now. Okay, gang. So what we've gone through the two memory systems. We've talked about the overall systems. We've given, I hope, some good study tips. Does anybody have any questions regarding memory, how memory works, how it sometimes doesn't work, about the two systems? Does anybody have any questions? You could put it in the chat, yes or no. You can unmute yourself and you can raise your hand. Okay. Awesome. All right, gang.